takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens?
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Magnolia Moonshot 2030. We're here today with Hazel Wong from the Nature Conservancy. And this is episode 8 of our Sprout series. And I'll say just a little bit about the series. We started about a year and a half ago with the plant series, and those were just very simple, authentic interviews with each of us to introduce ourselves, the founding Magnolias. And the Sprout series, which is where we are today, is interviewing just amazing women around the world who are focused on one or more of the complex challenges that we're focused on: climate justice, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and equity and equality in all forms. So we really look forward to hearing your story today, Hazel. And then we also have our Grow series, which shines a spotlight on teen girl cohorts. And the two specifically are in Pakistan, focused on gender equity, child marriage, and then one out of Europe, which focuses on climate justice and ecofeminism. So we are adding to our Sprout series today. So Anne, I'll pass it to you to introduce Hazel.
Yes, well, I'm excited that we are joined by Hazel Wong today. And Hazel, I figured it out. I think we first met in 2014 at the Nature Conservancy when I was on a faculty that was hosting the Sawhill program, which was for not just rising, but already made it managers who they were further developing to be global leaders. And Hazel was in that cohort and was a total delight, and was a key ingredient actually too about some of the energy in that cohort and the kind of places we went to explore deeper skills. So after that, I was part of the Mississippi River Basin work, which is, by the way, a whole system effort. It involved a systems map. Hazel wasn't so much involved in the mapping, but I remember you played a key role once the leverage points were identified. You helped really lead a campaign to pass some legislation, I think it was in Missouri, that affected the entire basin in terms of funding for the quality of water. And then finally, we were working on the Great Lakes Sustainable Fisheries Program. And that again was another whole systems with a systems map. And Hazel really led a work stream around a key leverage area that involved communicating and engaging the broader communities and stakeholder groups. So I have seen her magic. And Hazel, just in brief, has proven successful in leadership across nonprofits. Hazel has a unique style. And what I've noticed is in this era of burnout and alienation, like don't ask me to do another thing, if Hazel's involved, everyone signs up. They all want to be part of her efforts. And I think that's because, Hazel, you value relationships so much, and you definitely bring people together in a way that has everyone feel valued, everyone has a voice, and together you do powerful, powerful work. You're also, practically speaking, quite a skilled fundraiser and have quite a number of notches on your belt, so to speak, with successful campaigns. I also really want to emphasize how much, this whole thing about being relationship focused, you're partnership focused. And Hazel's leadership, it partners with government representatives, doesn't matter what side of the aisle, other NGOs or nonprofits, foundations, trustees and boards. I mean, you really bring people of different views together in a way that's so comfortable. So I know I want to hear more about that. And finally, I would just say you've currently stepped into the acting role, I know, for Managing Director of Public Policy across the Nature Conservancy. So I think they're lucky to have however long that exists to have you in that role, leading at the very top of TNC. So welcome. And I think you know how this is going to go, but the first question, we just really want to hear your story. Give us a chance to hear what shaped you and your approach and your path. So wherever you want to begin, I know a little bit about it. So I'll turn it over to you, Hazel, and if you could share that with us, and then we'll jump in with some questions.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for your generous words.
It's so wonderful to be here. And as you were introducing yourselves, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm just really honored to be in your company today. So thank you. I actually have the privilege, I suppose, of understanding, knowing the exact date that I became conscious of the fact that power, who's in power, matters. And that was June 5th, 1977. I was born in the Seychelles, a group of small islands of the east coast of Africa. And that morning I woke up and I saw my parents huddled next to the radio in the living room. We didn't have television on the island yet. We just had radio. And it was really strange to see them just standing next to the radio. And then the words kept repeating, do not leave your house. There's been a coup. They've installed martial law. Of course, I'm 6, going on 16, I suppose, in some ways, but still knew something was very different right then and there, but didn't understand what that difference would be. So it started showing up as, I went to an all-girl Catholic school, and you lined up in the morning and you go into your class. So there are times after 1977 where we would be praying for a schoolmate's father who had disappeared, never to be seen again. And it happened a number of times. And so in 1978, I can't remember, I think it was September 78, I was walking down the hill to go to the grocery store, and I saw a truck pull up, an army truck with guns. And they walked up, and I knew they were walking up to my house because that was the only house on the hill. And they walked up and took my dad out and brought him to jail for 30 days. And following that, it was tough going. His life was constantly in danger. He was let out of jail 30 days after he got picked up on the condition that he leave the country. So we left the country in September 13th, 1980. So Dad was part of the regime that took over illegally by force. In 1963, him, like a lot of people in Africa, whether you're Francophone or Commonwealth, given a lot of scholarships to go to college, right? In the United States, in France, in developing worlds. So Dad ended up in college, Hendon Police College in London, and graduated in 1963. And like a lot of folks that went away, came back and looked around and said, well, started opposing British or French rule of African countries. And he was one of them. He wanted the Brits out. And it happened in 76, but then he broke with his party after that because of different choices that they were making. But it was enough of a break that led him to be outspoken about taking the country by force and initiating especially a policy that mandated that all kids go to camp between 13 and 15. It's called National Youth Service. And he had 5 daughters. And if you didn't go to National Youth Service, you couldn't continue your education on the island. So there was no way. That was another point of we had to leave the country because otherwise we probably would not be able to further our education. So American Embassy helped us get out. And my mother's mother had married an American in the 1960s because NASA and Air Force built a tracking station in the Seychelles because we're 5 to 7 degrees below the equator. So a great way to track Soviet satellites back in the day. So grandma was already here with most of her kids, and it made it very easy to be sponsored to come to the US. And we landed in Las Vegas, September 13, 1980. And I thought I landed on the moon. You can imagine coming from a tropical island to a desert. And back then it was really a small place, right? I want to say about 250, maybe 300,000 people max. So yeah, the values and the conversations in my house growing up always stirred me towards, I had to be a public servant. It matters what you do. And again, it matters who's in power. And really, if I look back and connect the dots, I can see why I work in policy, why I work in conservation, and who I am today from that very day in 1977. So I'll pause there.
Well, that is quite the story. I don't know anyone else who has lived through a coup, or a coup attempt, I should say. So that shaped your, I'm going to be focused publicly in public service. So where did you start with that? And what was your first, awareness? Hey, I like this, or I'm good at this. I mean, what came after that?
Let me go back a little bit too, in a sense that I grew up on an island, and like a lot of places, the Seychelles is almost have a similar history of like the United States. There's no indigenous people to the Seychelles. So first slaves arrived with settlers in 1770. And you have a situation in the Seychelles too, where most of the landowners were the Grand Blancs, because the French settled it first, and that had slaves. So over time, you had Chinese merchants coming into the islands, and you had Indian merchants as well. So we have a melting pot of what we call the Creole race too there. In fact, my grandfather left China after the Japanese incursion with a cousin, came to the Seychelles and married a Black woman, my grandmother. They have 12 kids, and one married a French woman. So all of us with the last name Wong on that island were all related to each other. And I have a mother who's predominantly European. That's her culture on that island. And so even growing up, I saw the differences between my mom's side of the family and my father's side of the family. My father's side of the family, the 12 kids, all the women went to school. They were all educated. They've gone to school in France and in England and different places. There were school teachers, nurses, and psychologists. On my mom's side was a very different story. My European side was that they were raised to be pretty, and they were raised to marry well. And that's just, they just had the privileged life of their skin color in many ways, right? And, the economics of it too. So that was very clear to me growing up. I saw that, but I look like my aunts, right? I don't look like my mom. So I got it very early on that as a person of color, that's who I am in this world. I had to be educated. I had to do what I had to do in the world. So it really was grounded in me by my aunts and my uncles, who are definitely public servants. And then you can add to the fact that we're in the United States in 1980, and my father could not swearing at Ronald Reagan on TV throughout the 80s. Again, just picking up some bits and pieces, right? The socialization of it in many ways. So I decided to study communications, went to Cal State Fullerton, and then got my master's at UNLV. I worked for a little bit in television. And Roberta, I didn't have the satisfaction of, oh, this is really what I want to do. Right after I got inside the belly of the beast and was a television producer and assignment desk person at the local ABC affiliate here, it was just not something that I really wanted to pursue. So I went back and got my master's in political science. You will love this. So I had applied to law school here first year, and I was on a waiting list. And I didn't get in. I waited until July and I didn't get in the waiting list. And I had just gone over this horrible breakup and I wanted to go back to school. So I marched into the poli-sci department with my LSAT. And I said to the chair of the political science department, I want to go, I want a master's in political science. And he looked at me, he goes, you don't have the right creds for that. You only minored in it, blah, blah, blah. I said, yeah, but look, I almost made it to law school here. Let me, give me a chance. And I was very persistent. He said, okay, you get less than a B, you're out. And I go, okay, fine. So that's how I ended up not taking the GRE and getting a master's because I walked in. So that began my career in political science and working for the Democratic Party here in Las Vegas in the late 90s, ultimately joining the Nature Conservancy in 2002. I was recruited to work for the Nature Conservancy. It wasn't something that I care about nature, but I also care about women's issues. I belong to the Nevada Women's Lobby. I was chair of the Nevada Women's Agenda. So I could have gone multiple different ways. So when Amy Hellman came knocking on the door and she said, a few people told me to talk to you, I said, okay, and decided to take the job. I will say it took me a few years to say I was going to stay, but after 5 years, I was like, I can do this. I really like this, because I thought at first, do I want to work in conservation? Do I want to work in women's rights issues and children's rights issues? So it was kind of this internal debate of where I wanted to be in the world. But I knew one thing, I was done with candidate campaigns.
Yeah. So, well, what did your working experiences, you traveled that path, and your lifelong experiences as well with race and racial differences, what has it taught you about differences and bridging divides?
The one thing, it's interesting, like when you look at me, I show up as a Black woman in America. If you dig deeper culturally, I'm all about Asian food because my father cooked all the time, and he really only cooked Chinese food and Indian food. So during COVID, when they were in lockdown, I would have my grocery list and going to the Asian market every week for my mom and dad. So there's this cultural piece. And then I was raised by a dominantly European mother also in many ways, that she has her own way of showing up in the world. So I had to put all of it together. The one thing I will say is this: my upbringing and who I am today is such that you do not tell me where I belong. I think that's I have not internalized people's way of seeing me. You know, and they do see me they do tend to see me in a certain way. I will just share with you that on a hiring panel, when I started the Nature Conservancy, I heard later that somebody said, oh, is she going to be able to do the job based on who she has to work with? Well, my response to that was, can she drink a six-pack and walk out of the bar? Because that's a better test for the cowboys in Montana that I had to deal with, right? After meetings, we would go have a drink, and then Rock would drop me off at the airport, and off I would go, you know? So these are the kinds of, when you look at a person and you automatically assume certain things, but really, and to your, what you said earlier, Anne, relationship matters, how you're able to bridge that divide by just being interested in way who you are as a person, other people, and what you do. I think that bridges the divide. So I tell young people all the time, especially women of color, you get to decide where you belong. Don't let other people decide for you how they see you.
Mhm. That's amazing. You had an interesting story to tell too about working on some campaign in the South that you mentioned to me. Like, how did you partner with, again, the good old boy club, or, you know, for lack of, that's my term, not yours, but what did you find? What works? I mean, when is that effective? How do you bridge that? How do you bring those really different people on board with you and the purpose that you're out to achieve?
Well, let me start by saying it almost didn't happen, because early on in 2009, I'm sitting, imagine, in this big conference room, a lawyer's office, and I'm the only woman of color there with everybody. I think there's one other woman, white woman, and then everybody else, white males. And somebody mentioned, said, oh, we need to have Nick Saban and somebody else do our TV ads. And all of a sudden I'm like, and who is this Nick Saban and whoever this other guy is? That we haven't even tested them that they're good messengers. Well, I almost got kicked out of the room, because those are the coaches of Auburn and Roll Tide, the other
Alabama.
Alabama, right? There you go. So I had no idea. So I almost didn't even have a seat at the table that day, but by some way, somehow I was saved. Yeah, it's, you know, got to be diplomatic here and say that I definitely didn't see eye to eye with a few of them in terms of the campaign. Definitely didn't see eye to eye in terms of the process they were putting in place that I didn't agree with. The job that I do at the Nature Conservancy, I run a national team, and we work with our state chapters and partners to put measures on the ballot so that we raise money to protect land and water. And more climate resiliency is a big part of that package as well. And so when you sit at the table, there's a sense of fairness and equity that they did not show up with. All of a sudden, you know, they were contracting out to people that for campaigns, you know, the communications firm, we had not even had a conversation about it. They were already doing it. So that was number one. And we had different, sitting around that table. Another time, I was personally told that Black voters would not show up to vote for this measure for a while. It was 2012, and Black voters in Alabama know that Obama is going to be a first-term president, so they're not showing up. And my response was, 26% of Alabama voters are Black. And right now our poll shows that we have 25% of Black voters on our side. We can close, and our polls show we can also close the deal. We need to target, we need to outreach. And so they didn't feel as if that was important, and they didn't feel that was important because when you look at conservation, who works in it, who donates, and who are members, it's very homogeneous. But it's very different when we go to the ballot. When we go to the ballot, people of color tax themselves overwhelmingly to protect nature. And it's, in fact, I'll just share that we started out at 25% of Black voters supporting for a while, and we closed the deal at 82% because we had to do outreach. We just, you know, after a while, the fight, you just have to stop fighting, and we independent expenditures and send out mails, a series of mail to Black women with children. The chair of the Nature Conservancy's Government Relations Board that I didn't see eye to eye with, we even went out to dinner one night, and he took me to a country club. and a country club that when I walked in, everybody dining was white and everybody serving was Black, right? So I joke that they said one of us is dining tonight. So that was, sometimes you have to have fun with these things, right? Anyway, so we just got into our deep conversations and he looked at me, he said, Hazel, instead of disagreeing with me on the call, text me. I said, okay, I'm gonna text you and say you're full of shit. And he goes, this is good. We're understanding each other. That was after a bottle and a half of wine, right? You can get real then. So in a way, I have a way of being that my mother always says, how do you speak with people with that mouth? I said, but mother, I'm not swearing at them. We're swearing together sometimes. So yeah, so that was a tough one, but we did it. We just, again, you have to work through what you have to work through, in the sense that I have to protect the assets that we're going to bring to the table, which is usually at the Nature Conservancy, quite a lot of money for these campaigns. And I have a fiscal responsibility, a legal responsibility to make sure that money is spent in the right way. So I can't let you, whatever your point of view is about X, Y, and Z, change that. So in a way, I have to go hard to the goal line and deal with whatever situation that I have to deal with in order for us to get back on track and make things happen. And again, oversight of that funding, making sure it's spent in the way that we feel, also looking at the poll is going to get us across the finish line to a yes and a win eventually.
Great. You know, in your abstract, the article that you co-wrote, you mentioned conservationists are losing the battle to protect nature because they are failing to connect with the hearts, anxiety, and minds of a large segment of the American public. What you used heart and anxieties. I've never heard that before. And we were wondering, what does that mean? Could you say more about that?
Yeah, it's where we are here on climate is that it's an identity issue for the Republican Party. And we didn't get here overnight. We got here because a lot of money was spent over time to make sure that this became an identity issue. And that's what we have now. And part of that identity issue and the way it happened is that it preyed on people's anxieties and anxiousness about changes in the world, it's almost as if everybody was promised this American dream. And that American dream now is such that, oh, we have to do things differently. And, a lot of folks, I would say, do not want to do that in a personal way, to sacrifice their own way of life. And I don't think you have to sacrifice your own way of life, but that's how it was made. That's how the narrative was stoked, so that people can start feeling anxious and have this kind of fear identity within them about these issues. We have not recovered from that. If you look at my pollsters a few months ago, after the elections, climate change is now the leading issue that will tell you who's a Republican and who's a Democrat in this country. It's intensified, and we can see now with our lack of our inability to have solutions to fix an existential problem issue. So yeah, so there's a lot of anxieties around climate in America.
Conservationists is there an antidote to this, which is how can conservationists address anxieties, or are you just saying that's the challenge before us?
I think we're going to have to meet people where they are and bring them along. I do think, so this morning I received an email from a colleague in North Carolina, and North Carolina is what she describes as purplish red. In North Carolina, a few years ago, the words climate change, it was illegal to say. You couldn't, it couldn't be put in any kind of state policy. Last week, the state of Carolina passed millions of dollars for climate resiliency. So at the end of the day, we're still a country that is 50-50. We can't, we can power play in many ways, but in many ways, we also have to figure out how to work through the system and deal with the political structure so we can deliver for climate. And the way Catherine Skinner did that and partners in North Carolina, I call it, they were like a dog with a bone, right? Over the years, they were relentless in raising climate awareness, having specific meetings with and convening Republican conversations on this issue. I understand that the kind of big master narrative right now is that there's nothing that we can do on the other side, but I do think if you look under the hood, you start seeing some successes in places that we need to replicate. So people that are working for conservation organization, we have to walk that line of not buying into that big master narrative, right? Because we live in that same world, we see it, but we also can't be, I can't be the person that says, it's hopeless that the Republican Party won't show up on climate, because we have to, if we say it's hopeless, we got a problem. So we have to keep plugging away, and we can see the results coming in bits and pieces here. Look at the 13 members of Congress that also voted for the infrastructure bill, right? So this is how you position yourself to pick up incrementally. You may not get the whole shebang, but you pick up incrementally and politically where you need to, that allows you to carry the water on success. But you will have a lot of conservationists that have this kind of blanket approach of, seeing the world in a certain way, and that's fine too. It's a big tent, right? We can all fit into that big tent. But there are a few of us that we walk that fine line, because we have to work in a space that we got to keep pushing against the system, because we don't get to change the system. At least I don't anyway, at the Conservancy. I mean, if you work in other places, perhaps it's easier to change the system. Yeah.
That's a good reminder. It's like, do you give up or do you keep, like you said, under the hood? Where can we continue to fix this thing or work on this thing? This question kind of connects to this too, Hazel, but how do you connect your work through an organization as large as the Nature Conservancy? It's probably the largest NGO, I think, on the globe. But how do you connect it with real people on the ground who are most impacted by the climate crisis? How does that show up?
Yeah, well, I will start by saying that I think I would say we have not done a really good job in terms of that connection to begin with. And yet, in the same token, on the flip side, we've also been working very hard to get funding in the system to address climate issues, right? Whether it's catastrophic fire, floodplains, heat island effects, and other things that are important to society. And I think I was taking the conversation in my head in more of for communities of color. But what we haven't done is sit down with certain communities and say, okay, what do you need, right? There's this kind of, we've baked the pie, the policy pie, and then we say, here it is, go and get yours, right? So we're proud of some of the work that we have done in these spaces. But the question becomes, what do different communities need from us? And I think this is where, from the bottom up, is where we need to do better at that conversation and that intersection that we haven't been yet. We haven't done as good as we should. It's a big organization, like you say, a prestigious organization. And many times we've sit with like-minded partners. That is changing. I'm glad it's changing. But over time, I think, I will say this, I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. One of the things, working in conservation and working in the policy sector, you realize how little power you have vis-a-vis corporate America. And, even the way of people, the, short-term profit motives and people really not caring about this issue. Really, it's a third or second tier issue for many people. So you're constantly, it's a tough battle. So you're going hard to the goal line and taking any incremental wins. Well, we need to stop and think about, okay, well, who are we protecting the world for? And how can we do better at making sure the distributive impact of policy is there? I think before, there are gains and there are benefits for people, but we have to, I would say, scrub the policies and make sure that we are better at making sure that the distributive aspect of who wins in the policy is there's more equity in that, because we failed to do, as conservationists over time, we failed to do that.
I have one last question, then I think we're going to open it up for everyone. But in a time when so many efforts fail, I think this is a moment in time where, I'll speak for myself, I have to really keep my head in the game, my heart is in it. and not get discouraged, because a lot of efforts seem to not have the impact that we need, certainly, but that we'd hope for. How do you see the ingredients for success? And you've talked a little bit about that, but would you say anything more about what will going forward be ingredients for success? Like, if you do nothing else, you need to be doing this if your effort's going to have an impact in this space.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, it's I look at the pandemic and I think about the politicizing of the pandemic, and this is it's a personal life and death situation, a life and death situation for your family, and we've been able to politicize it, and it has worked. And I start losing, you start losing hope, right? You're looking at this and you're going, wow. But then you have to live in this world, and you have to figure out how to, like Voltaire said, kind of cultivate your own garden and make your way through the world. I will just share that on a personal level. And given that we're all connected through social media, the Colin Kaepernick situation really started. I've always known, but when you see your own friends posting about national anthem and respect the flag, and cannot have any really white friends, I should say, and don't have an ability to go outside of themselves and look at the historical aspect of, racism and all the ism. It was an aha moment for me that we're all raised in, socialized in a place that individualism, meritocracy sort of rules the day. And every time you start talking about racial disparities or dealing with past historical wrongs, it becomes suspects. And even your own friends and even the people that speak a certain language to you cannot show up outside that America they were socialized in to have empathy and to see the world in a different way. And because they don't see the world in that way, it impacts our ability to make policies, and it impacts the ability to make a lot of changes, right? Because it starts from that headspace. So I sit with that, and that's really hard. And I see it all around me in everything, whether it's inside the Nature Conservancy, or I'm sure inside a lot of places that are trying to deal with diversity, equity, and also in the policy space. And I'm really kind of stuck, I'm stuck in so many ways about how do we move forward. So for me, it's a lot of self-care right now. And it's just a lot of the space that I occupy and the space that I work in is being a voice for that, and being a voice to make sure that we're thinking about, even from the Nature Conservancy, how does our policy options now impact different communities, right? There is idea that we want to solve climate change, great, but how does the policy options that we choose, either at the federal or state level, impact different people? So these are the kinds of conversations that I'm having. These are different conversations that we've never had before. So that gives me hope, and that gives me hope that, everything in my life is incremental, right? Evolution. That's kind of the world of politics and policy. And so you win, you take the win, and you keep moving. And in the meantime, as a person of color, especially an immigrant person of color, not let that narrative set in about where do I belong, and the fact that for some people I don't belong in this country either. So yeah, this is a tough one, Anne, and I'm still working through it in many ways.
Well, I hear you, and I'll just say this, and then we'll open up for conversations. Your very presence, Hazel, opens up these conversations. So I just want you to hear that. So what's coming up for others? Anything people want to ask? And
Hazel, I'm so happy that you're with us today. I do have a question for you, but I just want to sort of share a little story with you first. I'm half Indian. My father is a Zoroastrian from Bombay. And when I was a little girl, my dad had a really, really close friend who was also a Zoroastrian, who married this gorgeous woman from the Seychelles. And they used to visit us often, and she would regale us with stories of the beautiful, beautiful country of the Seychelles. And I will never forget that. So I feel a particular bond with you over that. And I can't even imagine leaving your country and how beautiful it is, stunning, volcanic, gorgeous beaches and water, and then to move to Las Vegas. I came to the States when I was 18, but at least I came to the East Coast. I can't imagine moving to Las Vegas in the early 80s. I can only imagine what a culture shock that was for you. So I'm sitting here just thinking about this little girl in Las Vegas and honoring what she must have gone through at that time. And my question for you is, I was fascinated by your article that you wrote, and was the article written in 2012?
Which one? The one on the polling?
The one that Anne sent us, on the one that you spoke about the shifting of the emotional aspect of climate change.
Yeah, connecting with the hearts and anxieties.
That must have been 20, yeah.
So my question to you then is, when you wrote that article, do you see, now that we're in 2021, anything that you would double click on for that article or expand on in terms of how climate crisis is impacting most of us on this planet right now? And even if you don't see it, even if you don't talk about it from a perspective of climate crisis, the weather is impacting everybody. And I wondered if there is a different sort of macro orientation that you would have now as a consequence of that.
Yeah, I say that climate change in the past 4 years have come and slapped us upside our heads, right? In so many ways, everything that the prediction of what was going to happen is happening now. The fear though is that it starts getting to be normal, right? We start normalizing these things all of a sudden because it's a part of our daily world. And so, Jacqueline, I do think that there's a realization that it's happening, right? I think there's even that from a lot of different places. Now, we had a situation where deniers, right? And now you have a situation where, okay, people say it's happening. So now to go to the solution set. And this is where we still don't have the agreement about what those solution sets look like. The good news in this country is you have the decentralized power that allows you to work at the local, the state, and the federal level. That's good news. But the problem also is that you have some of the highest emitters of greenhouse gases are your Texas and your Kentucky, and places where predominantly red, right? So they're not dealing with these issues at the local and state level. It's a big problem. Therefore, that's why you need that national umbrella and that national policy to ultimately deal with it as a country. So this is where it starts getting sticky, in that when you kind of unpack the pieces, right? It's not, a lot of good things are happening, but where it needs to happen, it's not happening in the places where it's more political, and that stops our ability to make it into a national fix solution. It's definitely going the right way from where we've been. By the way, I meant to tell you, when I saw your last name, Kambata is a very popular name in the Seychelles too.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know there were Parsis there as well.
Yeah.
That's good. It looks like Tanya put a question in the chat. Tanya, do you want to read that or elaborate?
Yes, I'll read it. Your conversation really struck me, especially as you talked about being a woman of color. And the question I posed was, I understand that as a woman of color, we show up the way we want to, but as we all know, that is a constant battle in itself to do that, even to let people know, no, you're not going here and I belong here. So you're on the front lines of this. So what are some of the things that you do to self-care? And I actually posed that question before you even said, self-care. So I just wanted to know, what do you do to self-care? Because you are in the middle of a battle.
Yeah. So meditation, that's one. And I love Bikram yoga. There is this position in Bikram yoga called the camel. Put your hands back and open up your heart, your chakra. I will tell you, every time I come out of that position, I'm nauseous. I'm holding so much here. It's hard for me to even hold the position that long because I'm overwhelmed. I feel as if everything that I'm holding here is going through all over my body, and it's tough. So Tanya, I totally get it's easy. Sometimes it's easy to say, I don't let people tell you where you belong. And it takes years I'm 51, right? So it took years of training for that. I probably wasn't that person in my 20s. So, and part of that is listening to your gut, listening to your voice, into your own sense of self. And I always think about I trusted that little voice, and earlier on, it would have been an easier journey. And so I try as much as possible to name it and to call it out for young women, especially women of color, to say, you've got that, right? You've got that agency, and you've got to own it. And this is why these relationship matters. Somebody told me once upon a time, our chief scientist, and he was talking about just women overall. He made a comment to me one day that said, me and the CEO, we were talking about our daughters, and we have these conversations, right? But I noticed when I'm not having drinks with women as much, and I'm not going to happy hour, we're not having the same conversations. And I realized, and this was like maybe 15 years ago, certain conversations allows you to build trust, right? And when we're not building trust as women of color, as women within that informal relationship, it's part of what I would say keeps us from accessing that club in many ways. So how do we become comfortable with having these informal relationships and with stepping out of our own comfort zone, right? Things like that I think it's, again, the world that we live in just dictates that we figure out how to build the leadership skills and that internal way of being, so that we can build these important relationships in our lives that allow us to build trust and move forward. I probably went a whole different way here, Tanya, than you originally thought.
No. You answered the question. You said quite a bit. It's really been, I think I'm being more sensitive to you as a woman of color, because I'm right now I'm reading this book called Heavy the Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. And those are some of the things that are coming up, that the things that women of color carry, and how it's affecting us and how it's affecting our health, and how we need to have these honest conversations. So I think my heart's just like pulling because I understand that you're in a very unique position.
Yeah, well, I will just share one other thing, and Michelle, last year was a really hard year for me. During COVID, I had panic attacks. I had a lot of anxieties. Things were happening to me that I had no words for because I didn't understand what was going on. And I went to my doctor, and I worked through what I needed to with my doctor. I have been courage enough to say that internally at the Conservancy also, because, and I've had so many women reach out to me. Yes, I had to do medication, right? Because guess what? Not that strong in that way. And there was not, and I find that other women have given me courage because they've talked to me about their mental health. And so it's been my way to give back by talking about my own breakdown and my own mental along the way. I got this X, Y, and Z happened to me. Like I said, I had no words for it. I didn't even know what I was going through because it was the first time. So yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, Michelle.
First, I deeply appreciate your vulnerability and your candor and sharing your journey. I know that, I mean, it might be easy for you now, but it's not an easy thing to do because even as you share it, your emotions come through and I can feel you. My question or comment is, well, first I've got a comment. Or when I think of conservancy, I do think of rich white people.
Mhm.
And I've only seen, so this is really refreshing for you to share some of your perspectives, because I do think from a coming from the Black community, even the indigenous community, I've got several girlfriends, they would say the same thing. Are there strategies or programs where you engaging people of color more in the conversation? Now, I agree with you. I have watched the Black community in particular really resonate towards climate crises, especially as it affects them. Being a vulnerable population, the Flint water crises, all of these things from that perspective. But I'd say in general, it's anecdotal, most people I talk to, when you talk about conservancy, they feel left out. They don't feel engaged in the conversation. Are there things that the conservancy is doing?
Michelle, you're right. Again, going back to, if you look at the membership, it's probably 95% white. The workforce is still probably 96% homogeneous, and the donor base as well. And because it's because it has its roots from being a land trust and protecting land and water, it's extremely capital intensive. It is by far now the biggest conservation organization in the world. If you look at sheer numbers in terms of donors and money taken in, as well as workforce. It's interesting to the Conservancy because of the people that started it. I saw somebody posted a picture the other day of 1970 around the table of all the conservative executive. I think there's like maybe 15, 20 people, all white men, right? And the people that started the Conservancy and the land trust and buying land in rural America, for the most part, never looked at this issue as a social justice issue. It's interesting when at the Conservancy, right? They work in a whole different power structure and because of who they are, of the people that started it, the Conservancy has a different idea of who we are. And there are people like me that work at the Conservancy, and our starting point is that protecting land and air and water is a social justice way of being. So that's number one, because it's for all of us. And some of these lands that were homesteaded years ago because of stolen lands belongs in the public sector now. And a lot of times that's what we're doing, right? Buying those lands and turning them into national parks or state parks or migratory corridors. So there are public benefits, but these are public benefits that, again, more of a perhaps feel good for people, right? And there is a public benefit when we protect forests and avoid deforestation, because you have trees that takes out carbon. You know, if you look at in the United States, the paper industry that's now gone overseas, you have a situation where you had a whole bunch of land that could have been sold for development. Instead, it was sold. A lot of times, the Conservancy went and bought it and protected it and protected the timber and protected the water. Again, huge public benefits, right? But we've never talked about it in that way. We've never talked about it in a way that allows us to talk about the public benefits to people, and let alone people of color. So that's one. And then the second part too is that, and I mentioned this before too, some of the places where we are working in many ways are still in rural America, because it's not highly developed, where it is more of the wildlife corridor. But our science have identified now that species and the habitats are migrating north. I want to say a mile every 10 years. So that puts a whole bunch of land at risk of being converted to ag in the Dakotas, puts a lot of potential blockage in corridors for species. Those are all important pieces that we, that we work on, because those, at least for me, those are social justice issues. Now, going back to the tangible, the distributive aspect, and as a big organization, what is our role to ensure fairness and equity moving forward based on equitable distribution of benefits in the conservation space? What does that mean in the urban corridor? What does that mean especially when you have to mitigate and adapt to climate change? You have places like in Maine now where the culverts, you have to be bigger culverts because the precipitation is so much, right? Was it Ida that went through New York, right? There's now rethinking about how that's going to impact different communities. We have to be at the table. We are seeing in the different state chapters where my colleagues are at the table looking at adaptation for the urban core, or conversations that I would say the world needs to do better at. We need to do better at. There is such a lack of technical skills and lack of appetite to go that way too, that we have to build and we have to work on. But to your point, benefits in the backyard can happen, will happen, and should happen, because when we create money for conservation, part of that because we're creating a lot of money, should be able to go in people's backyards to benefit them.
And thank you for that. I appreciate that what should be, and it from an equity standpoint. But if you go up 30,000 feet, it's one system.
Mhm.
So the impact of deforestation in the urban cities that's been, you take like Detroit or Cleveland. Cleveland used to be called the Forest City, and now it's, hardly a tree anywhere in the city. But that impacts. I mean, they're interdependent. So to cut off, have the boundaries be the rural areas, you're not treating the ecosystem as a system. And so you can't make progress if you're not including the urban city.
Yeah.
I mean, nature doesn't cut off at the boundary of Detroit. And so that it's interdependent. I do have faith. There's in Cleveland, they started the Western Reserve Conservatory started an initiative called Thriving Cities because they became acutely aware of the interdependence. You can't have one without the other, ultimately. So, is there an acknowledgement of a compelling climate reason to include cities?
Yeah, absolutely. Michelle, we're working on, at least right now, we're working in Cook County, which includes Chicago, on a ballot measure that would bring in millions of dollars, exactly because they have the Chicago wilderness there. So there's definitely a lot of, at the state level, that's the one that I know of. I don't know all of them, but there's definitely more of a integrated way of working moving forward. We're nowhere there by any means, again, because of the past work and where we have focused and where we have bought land. But to your end, we're also doing a lot more purchasing land and also giving back to indigenous cultures too, which is really fantastic. I mean, that needed to happen a long time ago. So that's another big change and differences in how the Conservancy is working. So we're slowly migrating there, but we're nowhere there to where we should be. But the good news is at least there's that recognition now.
It sounds like another opportunity for a good partnership too, because it's going to take a village to solve these things. Listen, we have time for maybe one more quick question, but we like to end with a couple of consistent messages. Does someone have a question that's pretty okay?
Oh, well, I'll be quick. Hazel, thank you so much. You said something today about the influence or the lack of influence that NGOs have on corporations. And I come from a few decades in the corporate world at Nike. And just an observation, in 1995, Greenpeace came at Nike hard around the gas that we used in our cushioning, in our footwear. And it was a very adversarial relationship in the beginning. And it ultimately took 11 years for the entire supply chain to rid itself of that particular greenhouse gas. But during that time, we figured out how to change that relationship from adversaries to partners and to work together to solve the problem. So you spoke to that a little bit, but I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more now. The Magnolias is all about lifting women's voices and helping women step into their full power. How do you see that collaborative work evolving from a woman's perspective, a woman's leadership perspective?
Wow, if I waved a magic wand and all the women woke up tomorrow and started writing letters and showing up at the district and really holding our politicians accountable, we would live in a very different world. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that, right? We haven't marshaled our efforts by any means. So yeah, this goes back to, I belong to the Nevada Women's Agenda, Nevada Women's Lobby for years. I live in Las Vegas now, actually, that's where I'm calling you from. And this before I moved to DC in 2009, I did a lot of work with them. And it is so important to have groups at the local level, at the state level, that are holding politicians accountable, that are there supporting bills that are also, we went and got people to testify, right? And tell stories and made sure. So when I think about a group like Magnolias, how do you, because of everyone here, more of a national group, how are you showing up in your own backyard, in your own states? And some of the women activists that are giving their time, resources. We used to sit through 5 hours every 2 weeks to read bills, right? And highlight things and make it happen. It was time intense. I think that's one thing, right? It's how do you, in your own backyard, in your own way, part of that accountability factor. Because if we're not, I think pushing out information online to women and to other groups, fantastic, right? Keep people in the know, but you also have to be on the stump and making and holding people accountable in your own backyard.
Great, thank you. So we like to close with getting your thoughts on call to action. What call to action? And you may have covered some of this. So if so, you can just underline what call to action do you have and any advice for women who want to make a difference in this space?
Yeah, your own backyard accountability is so important. There's a lot of wonderful groups that are working to make sure that our voices are heard, and the voiceless too. There's a lot of racism and sexism and also all kinds of issues that a lot of these women groups take on. That's one. The second piece too, I see it with my own nieces, right? Smart, but they get caught up in the world of Instagram now. And I read recently how that is really changing. It's further, what's the right word to say there? I'm being diplomatic here. Women see themselves in one way, right? Without we're teaching our young kids. I think there's a big problem in terms of when my niece tells me, beautiful young lady, right, that she feels ugly because of other people on Instagram. I start thinking, okay, we got a problem here. We got a problem with young women to begin with, seeing themselves as objects and only valued for their looks. I think that's a problem that we haven't started to. It's even worse than potentially was before because of social media that we haven't thought about it, started to unpack. So that's another one. It's been top of mind ever since my conversation with her and then having read that article. So how do we think about in this space? And then the third piece is, in order for us to deal with climate, it's going to have to be a federal play. There are so many different groups out there working on climate, and they're all working in isolation. What does that look like if we can bring the power of the women's voices together? I mean, even at the Nature Conservancy, we have a Women in Climate group that we've put together. And I imagine, right, in the corporate sector and the different sectors in this group, it just feels as if there's just women in planet. Is it called Women in Planets? I forget the name, the group. There's all these different groups out there. And I'm thinking about how the collective voice, if it was marshaled collectively and put on stage in a bigger way, could make a bigger difference. Because we're out there, it feels as if we're not being heard enough.
Well, it's part of the Magnolia purpose, so we're on it. So anything else in closing other than, Hazel, a big thank you for joining us and sharing your story and, from the heart, as well as your wisdom of action and where you've made a difference and where others can make a difference. So it's so important that your message, and as I said, your presence gets out there. So I want to really thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you. Thank you for your time and thank you for all you do.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you, Hazel. That was
Bye-bye.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens?